Why do we ride? Why do I ride? I think that it is for me the ultimate medium through which to realise my birthright. The freedom to roam the land in which me and my forefathers were born. A land and a way of life which has evolved over centuries and which has been fought to the death for within the last century alone. At the end of World War II, a bombed and bankrupted Britain began its long journey of recovery. The emergence from the darkness into light was to take more than the ensuing decade, but by the early 1960s, the phoenix started to emerge from the ashes of its former life. A determined effort by governments back then to invest in the country, to take ownership of the national infrastructures of energy, water, transport, public health and social care, and to enhance those services through a programme of house building, providing lifelong affordable tenancies to working people who, for one reason or another, couldn't stretch to home ownership, all brought the country back to life. This was about more than the nuts and bolts, the bricks and mortar though. It was about a statement of intent, a social undertaking to the population to do everything in the power of the state to ensure that the lives of everyday working people were as tolerable, safe and fulfilling as could be, and the opportunities to climb social ladders were maximised. This so-called social contract resulted, amongst other things, in a rebalancing across the nation, in such a way that wealth was more evenly distributed than ever before. This in turn led to the emergence of the middle classes, who began to take up much of the void which had previously existed between working people and the aristocracy. There emerged for the first time a sort of buffer zone between those working to produce the wealth and those extracting that wealth from them. Semi-detached suburbia began to thrive and grow on the outskirts of our towns and cities, and for the first time property ownership was a realistic long-term aspiration for people on the median wage or less. All of this meant that young couples could fly the parental nest and start a family in a new home with either the security of a modest mortgage or that of state-provided housing where rents were kept affordable and no-fault evictions were unheard of. Working parents who had children relied upon extended family to provide childcare, and thereafter were content to leave 10-year-olds in the care of the school and provide a key to the family home, where kids could be safely left to fend for themselves for the couple of hours between the end of the school day and the return from work of either or both parents. That was my life in the 60s and 70s, and I always felt safe. Safe knowing that the friends and family living in our strong working class community were there to help if needed. It was never needed. I find it perplexing today that politicians and academics are endlessly theorising about the root causes of the decline in home-grown population renewal. To me, it is blindingly obvious that to bring up a family you need a home, and that if homes are unaffordable for so much of the population, then there will be little or no expansion in families in the way that we have long recognised them. As a consequence, it is projected that before too long there will only be 2 working people for every 1 retiree, whereas in the 60s, 70s and 80s that figure was around 7. This, to my mind, is unsustainable and is a direct and obvious consequence arising from an upward redistribution of wealth from the working and middle classes into the pockets of the super rich. Now, by now, you may well be reflecting that I've been down this road before. The typical Bingley Whelan narrative lamenting the grotesque inequalities of this modern age and yearning for a way of life long since consigned to history. Well, I'm no defeatist, and I refuse to believe that that which we once had cannot be recovered. Paradise lost, paradise regained. If, after the ravages and financial penury of the last war, we could build back our nation over just 15 years or so, then we can do it again. All that is required is a political class focused on the needs of the nation, not the needs of the political class, and their billionaire overlords, of course. And therein lies the biggest hurdle to be overcome. When I look at those green benches in the House of Commons, all I currently see are swarms of establishment figures. Those who are not city bankers, landowners, investors and real estate owners are people from working class backgrounds who have forgotten their roots, betrayed their class and jumped on the establishment bandwagon, and having done so have no business being in power. They are all traitors to a man and woman, and are in many ways worse than the aforementioned elites, who at least can be seen for the parasites that they are. But you might be asking, what has all this got to do with motorcycles and freedom? Well, allow me to explain. Our country is teetering on the edge of bankruptcy. The state owns nothing of value anymore, everything has been flogged off cheap, and the private sector has been allowed to asset strip the country, and then rent those assets back to us at hugely inflated costs. Imagine selling your motorcycle to somebody at a fraction of its value and then renting it back from them at an inflated rate. Insanity, right? Governments don't govern anymore, they just cope, and not very well at that. They are emasculated, castrated, hollowed out, and for the most part spineless. They lack foresight, ambition, determination, honour and character. The last quarter century has been defined by a succession of self-serving, self-obsessed, morally bankrupt administrations whose clown-show rhetoric has increasingly given the lie to their true agenda and has laid bare their political cowardice. Clowns and cowards at every turn, casting aside the needs of our nation as they scramble furiously to get their snouts into the trough of corrupted riches. You see, deep down, they all know what they are, what they represent. They all know that they don't have what it takes to put things right. They all know that they are at the beck and call of their corporate masters, and that they lack the courage to break away from that unholy alliance. They will continue to advance the narrative of the 21st century aristocracy in the hope that they and they alone will dethrone the few remaining scraps overflowing from the swollen corporate coffers. Meanwhile, mainstream media will continue to feed us with distractions in a patronising attempt to distract us from the realities playing out in plain sight, if only we would look. Never has the principle of divide and conquer been so ruthlessly employed by our news manufacturers. Yes, news manufacturers. Don't worry about the state using all your money to support endless conflicts and death overseas and lining the pockets of the arms industry. No, just look instead at those boats. And people actually fall for it. Well, not me. I'm not so bloody gullible. And I've seen it all before. So given that we have a hollowed out powerless state rapidly hemorrhaging the confidence of the people, what might we expect such a state to do in order to re-establish some semblance of being in control? The answer is simple. Concentrate on controlling what you can and forget what you can't. They can't control the wealthy elites with their masses of tax-avoided offshore cash and asset reserves, but they can control the rest of us. And that, slowly but surely, is exactly what they're doing. That seemingly inexorable crusade to legislate more and more and to support the enforcement of the legislation through an ever-growing surveillance network is due in no small part to their fear of a growing awakening amongst the population. The powers that ought not to be can no longer rely upon a lapdog media establishment to cloak their malign operations. In today's multimedia platform world, concealing the truth is becoming harder and harder. So government keeps trying to catch up with more and more control measures, but it is now so far behind the curve that the true voice of the people is starting to break through. These are therefore dangerous waters we found ourselves in, but they must be navigated if we're to survive the ongoing assault on our freedoms. There is a saying that the most dangerous animal is a wounded one. It lashes out with every last remaining sinew of strength with no thought for anything save the avoidance of death. This, I believe, is why we are seeing this endless creep of regulation, control and surveillance. These measures represent the last desperate attempts to save a political and economic model which has comprehensively failed to look after the interests of the population at large. So when I ride my bikes through a countryside still mercifully devoid of cameras, I do so because my notions of what it is to be free are held aloft in that moment, and I can dream of a world free from the shackles of a state determined to weaponize notions of digital IDs, social credit scores, surveillance networks and cash-free societies to strip away our liberty and in so doing our humanity.